I do think there are not enough of us pushing back because people are really afraid of the anti-Semitism label, and I was at first, so I tiptoed around it a lot. And I've spoken about this before. My father's Palestinian, and he was quiet his whole life. Didn't speak publicly about it, and it always tormented him. I saw it ate him up. He had grown up under the Israeli occupation. His family continued to be abused by Israel, living under the occupation in the West Bank, and he himself, when he tried to go back, often had to endure grave humiliations, and he was afraid to take us. He took us once in 1997, and it was scary. Like, there were some moments he thought the Israeli soldiers might just shoot us, so he said, "I'm not taking you back." So we never got to know our family there. And so, this was all, I saw it sort of eat him up, that he felt he couldn't talk about it. And he even warned me when I was young not to speak about this publicly, that the Zionists would ruin my career and I wouldn't have a chance of being successful. So for most of my life, I did keep pretty quiet about it. But the last couple of years were so awful. And I really think that we need to push back as a society against this.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Right of Resistance. I'm Kuros Charney. My guest today is Jenin Younes, the National Legal Director at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, where she works to defend people's constitutionally protected civil rights and where she has become one of the most forceful legal voices defending people who face retaliation for speaking out on Palestine. She herself has been outspoken about how accusations of anti-Semitism are weaponized to silence criticism of Israel and how institutions have often caved to pressure campaigns to fire employees for voicing such criticism. At a moment when the U.S. is both materially supporting Israel's continued violence against Gaza despite a declared ceasefire and punishing those who object to it, Jenin's work illuminates a deeper truth that dissent is not simply discouraged with social pressure, it is being legally targeted. She's here to discuss that and more on Right of Resistance. Jenin Younes, welcome to the show.
No, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm glad you're able to join us today. So my first three guests on this show have actually been professionals who lost their jobs because of their Palestine advocacy. So I thought it would be beneficial to talk to someone who's at the forefront of the legal battle to protect people who are in their position. So for starters, can you tell us a little bit about, any cases that you've been working on recently that you're able to talk about, or about the general climate you're encountering as you work on these cases to defend Palestine advocacy?
Sure. So I have a lot to say on this topic, so I'll try to keep it short. Feel free to interrupt me.
Sure.
I'm relatively new at the ADC. I started there in early September. So I have a couple of cases right now, but I haven't done a ton. One of them is on behalf of a woman named Jenin Younes, who went to a Code Pink protest and sort of anti-war. They're very anti-war, and they protest a lot of Israel's actions, especially in Gaza. The founder's actually Jewish, but maybe besides the point, maybe not. So Ms. Ali went to this protest against our contributions or supporting the state of Israel's military actions in Gaza. And a woman named Kamara Sumral, who belongs to a group called Beitar. I would describe them as an extremist group. I think even the Anti-Defamation League, it's very pro-Israel, did. They explicitly endorse violence against Palestinians and pro-Palestine activists. She alleged that Ms. Ali, our client, pulled her Israeli flag cape and choked her briefly. She admitted that she couldn't see. Ms. Ali had walked behind her, but a police officer testified on her behalf and said that he had sort of saw Ms. Ali pull the cape. Ms. Ali was actually acquitted at a criminal trial. The judge found that the police officer wasn't credible, and neither was Ms. Sumral. But they filed a civil suit. By they, I mean Ms. Sumral and her Beitar lawyers, who have a greater agenda here, in federal court. And they alleged violations of civil rights law, sort of racial discrimination. And it was a very odd use of the statute that is not no one's really ever seen before. It's typically used Section 1981. It's typically used to prohibit racial discrimination in contract making or state-based racial discrimination. So this had neither a nexus to any kind of contractual relationship nor state action. Also, we allege that even if Ms. Ali did this, which she denies doing, it wasn't about racial animus. It was about protest against Israel. Unfortunately, the judge issued a very problematic decision conflating the concepts of anti-Israel and anti-Semitic activity and said, if desecrating or pulling on the Israeli flag cape isn't anti-Semitism, I don't know what is. A Star of David, cloth, whatever. um, and I think this is an inherently problematic reasoning for a couple reasons. I mean, if you look at the context, this was a protest against what the state of Israel is doing. In fact, it was really a vigil for Palestinian children. The Ms. Ali and the others each showed up holding pictures of Palestinian kids who'd been killed in Gaza, and the counter protesters were there to celebrate the killing. It's clear that in context, this was about the state of Israel's actions. It's not as though Ms. Ali allegedly went up to someone on the street and pulled like a Star of David necklace. I would admit that that's a different thing, and that would be more indicative of anti-Semitism. But here, there were no indicia that this was about Jews or anti-Judaism. It was about Israel. So anyway, that's an ongoing case. We're sort of trying to get the judge to reconsider his ruling. We'll likely end up appealing. And then I have another case in California. California just passed a law that is designed supposedly to buttress anti-Semitic protections in public schools. Has a lot of problems with it, including it doesn't define anti-Semitism, but says schools are to follow this Biden white paper to combat anti-Semitism, which repeatedly conflates criticism of Israel and Zionism with anti-Semitism. So it sort of it doesn't exactly say what's prohibited, but it heavily implies that teachers and students could get in trouble for criticizing Israel and Zionism. So those are a couple of active cases that I have. This is all part of a broader effort, I would say, on the part of the Zionist lobby to silence, censor criticism of Israel in American society. And I think it's because they are losing public opinion, and so they know it's the only choice that they have.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that many observers have probably come to that conclusion. Certainly, my guests who I spoke to, that was essentially, the reasons that they were being punished or terminated from their work, right? Is that this tendency to conflate, criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism and basically treat Zionists as a protected class rather than adherents to a political ideology. Yeah. So I guess, I mean, the question, right? I mean, obviously, making these legal challenges to that seems, essential in terms of, I mean, public discourse, since you are someone who also is just very, outspoken publicly on social media. I mean, do you think that it's something that we just need to continue to highlight in terms of distinguishing between Zionism and Judaism, or, continuing to, or is there a way you think people need to frame their criticism of Israel to avoid situations like this? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have a lot of them. I am very outspoken, and a lot of people would tell me that's unwise. I think there's general wisdom that lawyers, especially if you're sort of an activist lawyer working for a cause, it's better if you don't say your own views, so that you're sort of deemed a more neutral professional and judges respect you as that, in that capacity, rather than being sort of known as an activist. I'm unfortunately unable to conform my behavior. I feel so strongly about this, and I do think there are not enough of us pushing back, because people are really afraid of the anti-Semitism label, and I was at first, so I tiptoed around it a lot. And I've spoken about this before. My father's Palestinian, and he was quiet his whole life, didn't speak publicly about it, and it always tormented him. I saw it ate him up. He had grown up under the Israeli occupation. His family continued to be abused by Israel, living under the occupation in the West Bank. And he himself when he tried to go back, often had to endure grave humiliations, and he was afraid to take us. He took us once in 1997, and it was scary. Like, there were some moments he thought the Israeli soldiers might just shoot us, so he said, "I'm not taking you back." So we never got to know our family there. And so, this was all, I saw it sort of eat him up, that he felt he couldn't talk about it. And he even warned me when I was young not to speak about this publicly, that the Zionists would ruin my career and I wouldn't have a chance of being successful. So for most of my life, I did keep pretty quiet about it. But the last couple of years were so awful. And I really think that we need to push back as a society against this. We can't be afraid. And the more people who say, you know what, label me anti-Semitic. I'm not. I know what's in my heart. I don't have a problem with Jewish people. I know this is a lame thing to say. I've always had a lot of Jewish friends. I grew up in upstate New York. I lived in New York for a long time. I've always been surrounded by Jewish people. I've never judged them or made any assumptions about them or had any problems with them. But there's been this sort of successful attempt to conflate criticism of Israel or Zionism with anti-Semitism. And the argument that's made is that devotion to Israel or the emotional attachment to Israel is so integral to Judaism that you're effectively discriminating against people for their religious beliefs. And this is it's a nonsensical argument. First of all, Zionism is not just the idea that Jews are entitled to a majority population in this biblical Israel, but modern Zionism, especially, and I would say even historical Zionism, says that they have a right to the land at the expense of the indigenous population, the Palestinians who've been living there, my family. To say, well, I just have this religious belief and so nobody can contest it. That's nonsense. And, the minute that your rights, your belief system requires infringing on other people's rights, then it's subject to contestation, and I give the example of, if I judge someone for being a Muslim, just being a Muslim, that's bad because I don't know exactly what they believe. But if somebody's subjugating women or, beating his wife and says, I'm doing this in the name of Islam, well, I have a right to push back and say, you know what? No, you can't do that. So those are, we really need to fight back against this. And I think people who thought that they could tiptoe around it and just be polite and protest on behalf of Palestinians without touching this issue were dead wrong. And I saw it myself, I tried to do that. I tried to just tweet pictures of dead kids and say, let's not do this. And I was still accused of being an anti-Semite. And it's the threat, them being able to wield that threat and to strike fear in people's hearts, which it is. It's somewhat successful. I was really afraid of losing my job for a long time, so I'd occasionally walk it back. That's how they win. So I think it's very important to speak out.
Yeah, did you, and this was at your previous job before you started at ADC, that you were afraid of losing?
Yeah.
And
I will say, for my former employer, he did not cave to pressure, but there was a lot of it. And the more I look back at it, the more angry I am, because it came from people like Ilya Shapiro. I don't know if you saw it. There have been tweets of his. He's explicitly said he said revenge in terms of killing Palestinian children is a nice byproduct, but the real goal is eradicating these subhumans, or this, he says, subhuman culture, I think, to kind of inculcate himself or inoculate himself against claims that he's just a genocider. But the fact that these people think that they can say that about my group of people and then whine about anti-Semitism when I say, don't do this, is just, it's outrageous. And it's, in my opinion, it's a two-tiered system where I'm considered less. The rights of me and my family to live are considered less than the feelings of these people about their precious state in Israel.
Yeah, do you see? Do you see that? Obviously we see that on social media. Obviously the mainstream media is, obviously, in my view, the mainstream media is still heavily, weighed in favor of Israel or the sort of narratives that support Israel, or at least minimize its crimes. Do you feel, or are there particular places where you see an actual dehumanization of Palestinians in the mainstream media? Beyond just sort of talking about Israel's right to defend itself, do you see these kind of coded or not so coded statements, in the mainstream media, or just in the way that they report on the subject?
Yeah, I mean, I would say most of the mainstream media, it's not explicit, but the way that, for instance, violence against Israelis is dwelled upon so much more than Israel's violence against Palestinians. And you often see, you sort of compare headlines. There are some Twitter accounts that do this, where
Yeah,
like when an Israeli is killed, they always say a Palestinian kills. Yeah, yeah, and then it's always the passive voice when it's Palestinians. And then they're just reported or buried, reported much less or buried much less. And I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the Screams Without Words, which was extremely poor, shoddy journalism that I think led to a lot of people to consent to what was going, or to look the other way about what happened in Gaza. And they've never retracted that article, never. So I think it's extremely two-tiered in the media too. And I mean, I don't read right-wing media that much. I mean, I don't really read mainstream media that much anymore. But like Fox News, I mean, it's much more almost explicit dehumanization. But there's the Palestinian perspective. Everything is always told from the Israeli perspective and not the Palestinian perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something that, we're trying to combat. I mean, certainly something that I try to address just in terms of, books that I recommend for people. I just say, hey, rather than just arguing on social media, guys, like maybe, why don't you check out some of these books that are either written by Palestinians or told very much from the Palestinian perspective. So I want to ask you a little bit about these anti-BDS laws, these laws that criminalize boycotting Israel. Do you find, I know a few of them have been struck down, right? But I think that people don't, many people, I would say the average American probably doesn't realize how pervasive they are, or how many states they've actually been passed in, or they've attempted to pass them in. Do you think that the more they come to light, or are you seeing, do you feel that more of them will be repealed as they come to light, or it will be difficult to pass future BDS laws? Or do you think, the opposite, that this, may become a sort of template for future restrictions on political advocacy, whether, for Palestine or other issues? Do you have any thoughts about that, or just
That's
general?
An interesting question. I think it... I think it brings up the question of what, I mean, public opinion, I believe, is rapidly changing against Israel in favor of recognizing Palestinians' rights. Whether or not that will be reflected in legislatures, state and federal, is a question. And I think a lot of these censorship laws are designed to silence pro-Palestine. So there's sort of a vicious cyclical aspect to it, where they're passing these laws to tamp down on pro-Palestine activism and to silence our voices. I don't know. So I don't know which will prevail. I don't know if it'll sort of be public opinion. And I think people are getting very frustrated, and you can see some changes. Like, I would say the election of Zohran Mamdani was pretty historic, in that he said things about Israel you could not say as a politician, certainly not New York City mayoral candidate 10 years ago, that Israel shouldn't exist as a Jewish state, which I don't think should be that controversial of an opinion. Like, why should they get to be a majority Jewish state in a region that's not actually majority Jewish? That necessarily entails suppressing some people and depriving them of their rights, a lot of people. So you could not say that 10 years ago. You couldn't say that 5 years ago, actually. And to become mayor of New York City, although I have some policy differences with him, I think it's really important that he won, because that shows, it's sort of showing the lobby, like, you don't get to just win this all the time. And then, like, candidate Seth Moulton said he's no longer taking AIPAC money. There have been, indications that it might be becoming a bit of a liability to continue to support Israel politically. But as to whether their tactics are going to win out or not, I can't predict the future.
Yeah, of course. I know. I was asking you to engage in prophecy. I guess I was thinking just more, and obviously a lot of these cases, it sounds like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it often depends on the judge. But I was just wondering if you're seeing from
Yeah.
judges who are, just getting, I mean, maybe they don't show their frustration, or maybe they do, inadvertently, but just feeling like, seeing, where laws like this, or people, filing, endless suits against their institutions, calling every, again, every criticism of Israel as, anti-Semitism, or, you know, just, I'm just wondering, just in your work as a lawyer, if you were seeing any type of shift in that respect. But I will not ask you to predict the future. Um, anyway,
No,
so if you want to add
I,
anything to that.
I, yeah. So yes, I mean, I would say there's a shift generally. As you noted, the boycott laws haven't been challenged successfully that much, mainly because what happens is the state will often, when someone challenges it, they'll be like, okay, we'll give you your contract. There have been one or two times that didn't happen, but that's what they do. And then there's no case anymore. It's also very hard. There are all these doctrines that allow judges to dodge questions. And unfortunately, a lot of judges love to dodge the main questions because they have political, or not political, but they have aspirations, career aspirations, and they don't want to do anything controversial that would get in the way. So there are doctrines called, people may have heard of, like standing, ripeness, where if you can't show that you are being harmed, like right now or imminently by the law, then you can't bring the case. They dismiss the case. So if you are denied a contract and you sue, and then the government says, okay, you know what, I'll just give you the contract anyway, then a court's going to say, oh, you don't have standing anymore. You're not being harmed. So this is the way that a lot of them have been able to get away with it. But I will say there have been a number of good decisions in other contexts that have addressed the attempt to conflate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I'd say that those have been in the last 6 months or so, which makes me think that judges are starting to see it. I mean, people forget judges are humans, right? They read the news, they look at social media, and they're as influenced, they can be influenced like the rest of us. And maybe 2 years ago, a lot of them saw the word Palestinian and thought terrorist, or, Hamas or whatever. And now they're beginning to see the reality. And so I think we have been getting better decisions in various contexts.
Okay, well, that's, I suppose, somewhat encouraging. All right, so I talk a little bit more about about Zionism and the conflation. I'm curious to get your thoughts. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you have mentioned that you were transitioning from using the term Zionism to Jewish supremacy, which I've heard a number of people say, and actually Maura Finkelstein and I talked about that on my first episode. So I guess let me ask you, I mean, if you wouldn't mind expounding on that, and what does this transition entail? What might you say to people who understand what you mean by Jewish supremacy, but maybe are, squeamish about attaching the word Jewish to a term that is meant, in my opinion, accurately to describe a problematic political ideology? What, any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think that Zionist fully captures what's going on, and that's why I've started calling it Jewish supremacy, which I think Norman Finkelstein does too.
Mm-hmm.
He's been an influence on me, but not the only one. Because it's not just about the right of Jews to return to Israel, or return. We can get into that at another point, but to live in Israel as a majority. It's also a system where, and I think because I felt some of this on a personal level, they believe that they have sort of the right, or they have the moral high ground by sort of destroying you if you say something about Israel or Zionism that they don't like. And so it's a much bigger system than that. It's, and you see how they go after people for anything and everything. And it's this, we will destroy you, so we will make sure that you never earn another dollar and you and your family die in poverty. I saw that myself. And I guess it's kind of radicalized me a little bit. I really I want to be a nice person. I want to get along with people. I enjoy that. But the way I was on the back receiving end of this just absolute mob mentality for saying fairly innocuous things, I think it's made me more and more radical. And I'm like, well, I'm going to call this out. And you're going to call me an anti-Semite anyway, even if all I do is tweet pictures of dead children. So, so I think it's important because the term is more accurate in it. And as I said, they're going to call me an anti-Semite anyway. So, and I don't understand, people talk about Islamic fundamentalism or Christian nationalism or this kind of stuff. Why can't we acknowledge that there are, strains within this religious system that are problematic? Well, I'm not saying all Jews are a problem, not at all, not by a long shot. I'm not saying Judaism is a problem, but this mentality that exists within Judaism is just like, and I would willingly say that about Islam. I'm not a fan of fundamentalist Islam. I believe in equal rights for women and gay people and all of that. And I will say, I will criticize fundamentalist Islam or Christian nationalism. So I think, we need to get away from this, idea that Jews are just eternal victims and we can never, ever say they're just people like the rest of us. And they can also develop philosophies within their religious system that are problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can I ask you, this may be there may be many questions in this question, but, going back to your upbringing, you touched upon sort of what you witnessed emotionally, what your father was going through. Did you get a lot of, political or historical education on the subject, in your family, and just what was it like sort of learning that and then coming up against this completely opposite narrative in American society? Because, we sort of by default in the United States grow up with a very, Zionist leaning, or Jewish supremacist, if you will, leaning narrative of Israel. Did that make
sense? Yeah, my dad talked a lot about the history, actually. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, so I grew up with it. And, I grew up with the Palestinian perspective. And I made a point to educate myself and to read the arguments on the other side. I found them highly unpersuasive, and they're based on, fraudulent facts to Joan Peters' time immemorial.
Time immemorial.
That's been debunked by various scholars. Yeah, from time immemorial. I guess I can say I knew that most Americans don't know much about the subject, but I was surprised by the degree to which completely people who are not knowledgeable, which is fine. I don't know anything about a lot of world conflicts. It's okay. We don't all have time to learn about everything. Sure. But I was surprised the degree to which people who knew very little would dig their heels in and just insist that, Palestinians are all terrorists. And even I have had friends, past tense, on October 7th who were very bigoted towards Palestinians and Muslims. And I kind of learned that after we discussed it. And I really begged a couple of them, in the interest of our friendship, can you listen to me? Can you listen to my perspective? What you're saying that Palestinians just hate Jews for no reason whatsoever is wrong. It's not true. I can tell you this from my own experience. And they wouldn't. They just wouldn't listen. And, you can't really be friends with somebody who won't be at all open-minded about it.
Yeah, it's really hard. I think a lot of friendships have ended post October 7th for that reason. Okay, so let's talk maybe a bit. Well, okay, a few things actually, if I can shift course. I believe you've argued a little bit about how the government, has used social media companies as, proxies to censor free speech. Can you expand on that? And also just in terms of legacy media, I know, you may have some thoughts. I think you did post about the recent appointment of Barry Weiss to CBS News to head CBS News as well. But yeah, I mean, but tell us a little bit about, how you think they're using social media to censor free speech.
Yeah. So that was my life for a few years, actually. I was involved in a lawsuit that was, or I was one of the attorneys representing the private plaintiffs, individual plaintiffs, in a lawsuit alleging that the federal government had coerced and threatened and worked with social media companies to suppress constitutionally protected speech. These were sort of what would be considered right-leaning causes, like COVID misinformation about the COVID vaccines, the 2020 election. And this was mainly the Biden administration doing that. So that case actually ended up going to the Supreme Court, and we lost on standing, which I mentioned earlier is a way for feckless judges to not have to deal with things they don't want to deal with. They said that basically, yes, the plaintiffs had been censored. Yes, the government had engaged in this kind of inappropriate activity. I don't think they acknowledged entirely was inappropriate, but alluded, okay, maybe they did that and it was bad. But they said basically you can't show your clients were censored because of the government's conduct. The social media companies might have censored them on their own. And so you lack standing because the plaintiff has to be able to trace their injury to the defendant that they're suing. And so here we were saying that the government was violating the First Amendment by involving itself in content moderation policies of private companies. And I think the court just didn't want to deal with the question, and so they dodged it. The Trump administration, now incidentally, came in on a white horse, I think because of our lawsuit, saying we're going to end so Trump issued an executive order on January 20th or 23rd, I think, called restoring free speech and ending federal censorship or something, which is pretty funny given what they've done. I mean, if you want to be optimistic about it, I mean, because they've really been the opposite. But so I don't know what the current administration is doing, and I don't know what other governments are doing. I think we have some indications that Israel is directly involved in social media censorship. I expect, given the obsequiousness of the Trump administration to Israel, that they might be facilitating that. But I don't have direct evidence, and it's very hard to get. And that was sort of one of the points in our lawsuit was like, how are we going to show, like, we need internal emails. How are we going to show that our clients specifically were censored because President Biden said something? Like, that's a ridiculous standard. You're never going to be able to show that. So the standard should be, and this is what it had been before, the standard should be that if the government is behaving inappropriately, the companies are acting in predictable ways, and your clients suffered some injury, we can presume that they were affected because of the government's action. That should be the standard. But unfortunately, the court didn't agree.
It's a shame, but yeah, that standard makes sense to me. Okay, so then in regards to the white horse that the Trump administration came on, obviously there have been some concerns about authoritarian overreach otherwise. I guess maybe this can this can maybe lead to my broader question, and feel free to link it however you want, but just imperialism. And there's a lot of talk, I think, amongst Palestine activists these days about what is often referred to as the imperial boomerang, right? And this idea that fascism is imperialism or colonialism turned inward. And is that connection between U.S. imperial power abroad and the suppression of dissent at home, is that being exaggerated, or is Palestine the central issue of our time? Those are your two choices. No, is it? What do you think? I mean, what do you think about this issue? I mean, in other words, do you think that just people in general, Americans in general, need to care more about this, if not because the U.S. government is supporting terrible things abroad, but because it is going to, or is already coming back to us at home?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the censorship that we're seeing at home is to protect Israel. They're directly connected. And I would say one of the worst things that the Trump administration has done, in my opinion, is these deportations of people for anti-Semitic activity, which was really just pro-Palestine activity. And the justification for it was just awful, legally awful. It was awful watching all the politicians who claimed to be for pro-speech justify it. It was just a complete shredding of our Constitution and the idea of free speech in this country. And one of my favorite tweets of all time, I forgot who did her name, but it was something like, the Zionists will destroy every institution in America, free speech, universities, everything to protect Zionism. It's really true that America won't be free until Palestine is free. And I think, you really see how this is interrelated. I thought that was just a brilliant tweet and just so on the nose, that we are not separate, and for people who think what happened in Gaza can't happen here, I mean, the government just saw they could get away with calling children terrorists and killing them like cockroaches. Like, if you think that's never going to be turned on you, you really don't know anything about history.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very valid point. So I think that's something maybe that a lot of people grapple with, is wrapping their heads around, the influence of Israel, or Zionist influence. In other words, the influence of people in the United States who support Israel. I was at a panel the other night just, about AIPAC and AIPAC lobbying, and they really this was actually put on by NIAC, the National Iranian American Council, and they were talking about how, at the end of the day, AIPAC is just a lobbying group. They organize, they get together, they do things that lobbyists do, and that's how they're successful. And if we approach it the same way, we can obviously we can push back against their influence. But then there's also just the larger question of, like, putting aside lobbyists and just, oligarchs or whoever, well, maybe not putting aside the oligarchs, but, people of influence in the United States, and just thinking about the U.S. government's actual imperial interests. It's like, how do we deal with that? How do we, because it's also interesting, and I'm sorry, this is a bit of a tangent, but since this is something that you posted about too, to see the president of the Heritage Foundation come out and say criticizing Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitic, and then people losing their minds over that. I mean, Israel supporters losing their mind over that. I mean, that to me was very surprising. I mean, this is the organization, right? That is the architect of Project Esther, right? To suppress the Palestine movement. Like,
yeah.
What was that all about? Like, why, where did that come from, do you think? I mean, obviously you're not. So I guess I'm just trying to, I myself am trying to wrap my head around these different reactions. You know what I mean? Because on the one hand, you have the Trump administration essentially using Project Esther as a model to deal with the pro-Palestine movement, right? And then by the same token, the Heritage Foundation itself that created Project Esther coming out and then, saying, it's not necessarily wrong to criticize Israel, or it's not necessarily anti-Semitic. Anyway, as an observer, but also as a legal expert, what do you think about?
Well, I was very surprised to see Kevin Roberts say that. I used to go to conferences there. I'm not like conservative or anything, but because of some of the work I was in, I sometimes spoke at a couple of heritage things, mainly about the censorship work I did or anti-censorship work against Biden. Because for them, it's all political. Yeah. They weren't really anti-censorship. I was a little naive, maybe, in my involvement. But all I did was give a couple talks there. But they said something shortly after October 7th. They put out a statement saying Palestinians couldn't assimilate in the United States and shouldn't be welcome here. And I and Justin Amash, the former congressman who's also Palestinian descent, criticized them harshly and said this is extremely bigoted. They eventually deleted the tweet, but it took them a few hours. And so I was very surprised to see Kevin Roberts say this, to say the least. I just assumed they were the most extreme pro-Israel fanatics there could be. I mean, obviously, when in any organization there are people who have different opinions, right? Like it's not a hive mind. But I was very surprised that somebody with his position held this view. And I think, there's an argument to be made that it wasn't just about saying you can, well, no, and never mind. I take that back. It was definitely in large part about that. I do think that part of what sparked the whole thing was that he refused to disavow Tucker Carlson for having Nick Fuentes on his podcast, which is big, the big debate now that I'm trying to stay out of. Because it involves too many complicated issues that are too much nuance for Twitter. So afraid of things getting taken out of context, because I'm not a cancel culture person. I think Nick Fuentes has said a lot of disgusting things. I also think he said a lot of them when he was 18, and he's kind of a troll, and he's trying to get attention. And comparing him to Hitler is a little bit silly. He doesn't have anything near the power. I don't know that Fuentes actually really wants to kill people. Maybe he does. But it's a complicated topic. And then whether Tucker Carlson should be condemned for having him on is another story entirely. So I've tried my best to stay out of that debate.
Yeah, well, did you watch the interview? I didn't see the Tucker Nick Fuentes interview.
I did. I watched all of it. Well, I should say I listen to podcasts while I run, so
sure.
I don't have the patience to listen. But I want to know, I want to be informed. And I was curious because I haven't followed Fuentes closely, and I didn't know what he'd said. So I've also looked that up on my own, and he's said some disgusting things. And I found some of their conversation about immigrants to be very I did not like it at all. I was offended, frankly. And I think what they said about women was very offensive. I turned it off, actually, when they started, because they both were talking about how, we're meant to live in a patriarchy and women are meant to stay at home. And I do not believe that at all. That's not the life I wanted to live. And I don't think they know what they're talking about. There have been many non-patriarchal societies throughout human history. So I just thought it was very offensive and stupid conversation. And so that was when I stopped. But
right. Okay. So it sounds like substantively the conversation was not good either. It wasn't just the fact that he had the Nick Fuentes on it, but it was the actual content of the conversation.
There were interesting parts. And people are criticizing Tucker for not pushing back. He actually did. He just did it pretty politely. He's not someone who's like, gotcha, and he was very critical of Fuentes' sort of collective notions of guilt or collective, stereotyping, which I am too, obviously. I don't think we should ever make presumptions about people and their beliefs and actions based on their possessing immutable characteristics.
Well, I don't know if you watch or listen rather while you're running to Tucker Carlson, regularly. Again, I know he's an entertainer, journalist, if he has a brand, but I'm not entirely sure what to. I don't watch his show all the time, but I'm not entirely sure what to make of his arc, if we can call it that, particularly. Because then I see him, interviewing Ted Cruz and really taking him to task over his sort of unflinching support for Israel. Or I don't know if you saw any of that Sam Altman interview, which I didn't entirely believe what I was watching. I just saw a clip of him.
I tend to watch.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I tend to watch the ones that get tons of. I don't watch it regularly or listen regularly, but the ones that just are blowing up and everyone's talking about it, I'm like, well, okay. Right. I watched the Daryl Cooper one.
Mm-hmm.
Because I kind of want to know what everyone's talking about and judge for myself. I don't just take for people at their word for their characterizations of things.
Right. Well, I guess, but what would also be interesting, I think, maybe to hear you expand on a little bit, is just because you have, I guess, your work has dealt a lot with, it sounds like, sort of cancel culture, in various respects. Do you have, I don't know, what are your thoughts, I guess, about sort of the evolution of this? I know a large criticism, which of course I don't agree with, but a large criticism of the complaints of pro-Palestine activists, since October 7th, is that they're, getting canceled or they're getting, and so, people like Bill Maher or whoever goes on his show kind of wagging their fingers and say, oh, well, the left, you wanted to cancel everybody, over your, whatever they consider, woke stuff, right? Your woke stuff earlier. And now this is what you get. Now, of course, I mean, there were a lot of problems with what they were saying, just the fact that they're citing like, they're, wagging their fingers at Harvard students for something that happened at Yale 10 years before. And, it's like not even the same generation really.
Yeah.
But I guess,
yeah,
as someone, I mean, I myself, I was not in favor of that type of cancellation then, and I'm certainly not in favor of it now when it concerns people that I'm more politically aligned with. But you already made the point, I guess, that it, a lot of it's just political, right? People don't actually care about free speech. They just care about their own free speech. I guess, do you have any thoughts about sort of what this is doing to the to the cancel culture debate? And legally, do you think things are going to get worse for us as a result, or better, or who knows? Again, I don't mean to ask you to make predictions, but or just, are you seeing any kind of trajectory, I guess? Whatever.
So I find cancel culture is probably.
Sorry, whatever question you heard
it's
in there,
probably one of. Yeah, no, I got it. I find cancel culture to be one of the more fascinating debates, maybe more than censorship, which I think is kind of easy. Like, I just tend to be anti-censorship unless, there are some very narrow exceptions. Cancel culture is different because it's not about government censorship. It's something else. It's like a social ostracization of people for their views. And I think, we can all agree there probably are some things, like if you go around saying, we should murder Palestinian children because they're part of a subhuman culture, I actually think you should be excluded from polite society. I don't think, Ilya Shapiro wants to be a judge. I don't think you should be able to be a judge because you can't be fair. I don't know that you should be able to have a teaching position because you might, you clearly can't perceive people as individuals. It's hard to delineate exactly what the line is and where it's appropriate in different places. And I think our society is still sort of trying to figure these things out. I mean, 15 years ago, you really couldn't just air your views very easily to the entire world, and you usually didn't do it at 11 p.m. when you were drunk, which I know some people do. And, what they really think comes out. So I think our society is grappling with it as a result of social media in a way that we never really had to before. Because it was just very different before you could get on Twitter or Facebook and say these kinds of things about people. And I don't know, I don't know exactly what the line is. And of course, there are people who want to say criticizing Israel should make you cancelable. That's what we were getting at earlier. I think that's absolutely absurd. And how do we come up with sort of common sense lines to draw about what's a legitimate thing to cancel people over in what context? And I think another thing is, like, it very much depends what context it's in, right? Like, I think a kindergarten teacher who goes online and says, I think Asian children are inherently smarter than black and white children. Like, I don't think you should be teaching my kid. But should that person be able to work at Walmart? Maybe. Like,
Sure.
I don't, like, maybe you should still be able to make a living. I don't know. These are like very difficult questions, and I don't think we've totally ironed it out. But I think from my side, what I can say is it's the completely lopsided way in which cancel culture is utilized that I think is just outrages a lot of us. And right now it's really this, you can go on there and you can say Palestinian babies will grow up to be terrorists, kill them all. And that's, you can get a job at Heritage or the Free Press, like Eli Lake and Ilya Shapiro. And you say, stop this war, and you're a horrible anti-Semite who deserves to be, ostracized from polite society. So I think that's really what evokes outrage for me. And there needs to be consistency. And we need to recognize that some things are worse than others. And saying you should kill people because of their race or religion or ethnicity is probably the worst. Saying that people, you don't want people here because of their race, religion, or ethnicity, or that they're stupider, which some Nick Fuentes, I've heard him say certain
Mhm.
groups are. That's bad, but it's not as bad as advocating for killing. So I wish we had a little bit more nuance and gradation, and then consistency. Instead of elevating one group's grievances far over others.
I mean, yeah. I mean, so is it just racism? Is it about decolonizing our this was the title of my last episode, decolonizing our minds in terms of like, because again, this has all been so drilled. I mean, going back to Palestinians specifically, just the dehumanization, it's just been so drilled in and, just become so matter of fact to people that it's like, I mean, obviously the images that people have had to look at have made somewhat of a difference. One thing that, I mean, not that this should come as any surprise to me, but it was like 2 days after the quote unquote ceasefire, the most recent quote unquote ceasefire, the New York Times published an article talking about like, I don't remember the exact headline, but basically like, will Israel be able to, regain support from American, the American public, or when will it? And it was, I mean, if I'm being honest, and I mean, I doing a podcast here, maybe this isn't like super journalistic integrity here, but it was infuriating, right? To read that, because I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, this is, it seemed so, and obviously, the New York Times has come under enormous criticism for the way that it's covered this genocide for the past 2 years. But this presumption that it's just a matter of, well, now that, or trying to frame it that way, like, oh, well, now that the war is over, or, you got your ceasefire, so now we can all just go back to normal. And I do worry that, or I do wonder if, if given enough time, it's just they're going to sort of, erase or, just erase public memory. I don't know how you can when it's been so documented, but I guess so. So it remains to be seen. What I guess how this will manifest in history books, although I'm not super confident, given that if teachers can't say anything critical of Israel, how do they even teach about this conflict? You know what I mean? It's like there's this effort to almost censor the teaching of, and I'm sorry to use the word conflict. I know it's not, my favorite word to describe this, but this asymmetrical brutality and occupation. So anyway, I do have a question in here somewhere. Well, yeah. And I guess, so yeah, I know you're not an international lawyer, but it's like how much, emphasis now needs to be put on really just every possible legal challenge we can make, every, and what do you sort of, we as a public who are not lawyers, like what can we do to sort of support that, support holding people accountable for any kind of complicity in what's happened, either, here in the United States or, international, beyond my fantasy of Mamdani arresting Netanyahu if he comes to New York, which is, I know is a nice fantasy.
I really would love to.
Anyway,
I would love to see the Gaza war crimes tribunals, but I can't say. I would be surprised though if people will forget. I mean, especially the young people who I think, to them, the images they saw were ingrained, etched in their minds probably forever. And their view of Israel is just not, I think it really matters what people grew up with and the ideas that they had, that they grew up with. And you sort of see the boomers, I hate to generalize, but, and that's not exclusively for sure, but even ones who I think are sympathetic to Palestinians very, very much see Jews as kind of eternal victims. The Holocaust is, emblazoned on their mind as the worst thing that's ever happened to humanity, which maybe it is. I'm not going to argue about about which genocide is worse than another. Very well might be. But it's very hard for them to see to not see Jews as victims. And I frankly don't think right now in this day and age, Jews as a group are victims. There's not, Jews are not encountering discrimination in the workplace or educational institutions just for being Jewish, despite the many attempts there are to conflate people pushing back on Zionist views. And I think my generation and younger sees it very differently. Like I grew up with like Jewish people around me being treated completely like I was, or arguably better, frankly, and not being deprived of anything. I think there's no justification. There's no justification, and not for trying to censor or silence or destroy people's lives for opposing what Israel does. And so I think there's just a very, very different view. And I don't think that anything Israel does can change that. They are, they're trying very hard to buy up social media so that, because they know that's where the kids are getting these images. But I think, like 1/3 of New York City Jews voted for Mamdani. These attempts, these are very telling. And it's hard to count, based on anecdotal experiences, but I know so many anti-Zionist Jews, so many, I mean, unbelievable quantities that it's hard for me to, I think that Zionism is really limited to, I shouldn't say limited. It is a lot of American Jews and Jews in other parts of the world, but I think a lot of Jewish people outside of Israel are not that Zionist. And so things are just changing rapidly, and I don't think it's going to be in Israel's favor.
Okay. Well, listen, we can wrap it up in a minute here. Do you have any advice, tips for anyone in the average person here in terms of what we might do to push back against censorship? Or do you have any advice to people who maybe still are somewhat afraid of speaking out on these issues? Do you think that if they're in a position where they, do feel that they're going to be, harmed professionally or whatnot, should they just keep quiet? Do you have any advice to people on that front, or just general resistance advice against this type of censorship and suppression of speech?
Well, I can't tell other people what to do, but I can, and I don't want to urge people to take risks that they're not ready for. I have a defect where I can't not say what I think.
Yes.
I don't know that it's served me well.
Seems like it's served me pretty well.
It's been interesting. It's been interesting. If you are secure in your job, and you want to, or you have any desire at all, I think it's very important for every person who speaks out, many, many more start to come forward. I mean, I wasn't the first. It took some other people doing it for me to say, okay, you know what, I'm going to do this. For my fear to be outweighed by my desire to speak out, basically. And I do think we have to push back as a society, and especially against the censorship. I mean, the censorship is really bad because if you can't have conversations, then you can't really have a free society. I mean, if you can't speak about these things. And there's also this, tendency to really punish people for minor transgressions, sometimes misspeaking, sometimes saying something not so eloquent. And I'm not talking about Nick Fuentes here, who has a very, very questionable views, or at least purports to. Again, I always get this feeling. He reminds me of like my little brothers when they were contrarians. They never said anything like that, but they were still always trying to get a rise out of you by saying the most outrageous things. And his demeanor like reminds me a little bit of that. So I have a hard time taking him that seriously. But like as the serious threat, he says things that are terrible. But in any event, I mean, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about where someone maybe accidentally says Jewish instead of Zionist or whatever, and we try to destroy this person's life, and we should be able to have some frank conversations. And Palestinians, we've had to hear the most atrocious things about us for decades. So, I think we can deal with a little discomfort, and we should, and we might have to.
Yeah. Well, in terms of your defect about not being able to keep quiet, I think many people are grateful for that. So I hope you're never cured of that defect, because I think it's valuable to many people. In any case, well, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing all of your thoughts. I really appreciate it. This was a very interesting conversation. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to Right of Resistance. And please join us next time. And actually, just before we go, Jenin, can you tell us where people can find you on the internet, where they can follow what you're doing? Where would you like people to be paying attention to what you're up to?
Yeah. So my Twitter handle is just my name, at JeninYounesESQ, Esquire, Twitter handle. And then I work for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. That's adc.org. If you're so inclined to support our work, we do have a donate button, and we are funded mainly by grassroots donors. So if you like what you're doing, if you like what we're doing, I'm sure you like what you're doing too. We are very grateful for any contributions. Even $5 helps us. So, and I also have my own podcast with my co-host Melissa Whitty, Previously Prohibited.
Yes,
so those are the places you can find me.
And it is a great podcast, so definitely I recommend people checking it out. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone again, and thank you, Jenin Younes. And please join us next time for more talk about propaganda, injustice, and ways to resist. Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and consider supporting the show on Patreon. Right of Resistance is an independent podcast. We don't have corporate sponsors or media backers. We rely on listeners like you. So if you want to help us grow, visit patreon.com/rightofresistance to become a member for as little as $3 a month. Every contribution makes a difference.